Our first speaker is very well known to most of you. He's also been a friend of ours, I guess since 1998. His name is John Fund. He was born in Tucson, Arizona. He's an author, journalist, columnist, and current senior editor of American Spectator. He was previously a writer for the Wall Street Journal, where he wrote a weekly column named On the Trail and contributed to the journal's newsletter, Political Diary. Fund's articles have appeared in Esquire, The New Republic, and National Review, among others. He is a frequent contributor to Fox News and has written 3 books. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you John Fund.
I may have been born in Tucson, Arizona. I spent 1.5 years living in the Philadelphia metro area. Lived on Valley Run Drive in Sherry Hill and Bettlewood Lane in Marlton. So I do know Philadelphia very well, and I'm very fond of it. I come to you at a very propitious time because apparently Pennsylvania is right in the middle of a seminal debate on voter integrity. And coincidentally, 3 days ago, my new book was published. Fraudsters and bureaucrats. See how I meet market demand? How fraudsters and bureaucrats put your vote at risk. This sadly has become a much too passionate and much too partisan and much too polarizing an issue. I don't think it needs to be. My premise is very simple. It's the same as that of Democratic Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut, who was the co-author of the Help America Vote Act, which tried to repair some of the awful problems we had that led to the Bush v. Gore recount of 2000, which paralyzed the country for 47 days and ultimately was heard before the Supreme Court. What Chris Dodd said is, our goal in this country is to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We are Americans. We can do both. These goals are not in conflict with each other. They are complementary. Voting is a right. It carries with it responsibilities. We can balance those. Here's why this is important. We have 2 civil rights when it comes to voting. One is the right not to be intimidated, blocked from voting, prevented from voting. We fought a great civil rights struggle in the 1960s to get rid of poll taxes, literacy tests, arbitrary restrictions on voting. We need to preserve and maintain those gains. We also have a second civil right. That right is that each and every one of you should not have your vote stolen from you, not have your vote disenfranchised, not have your vote canceled out by someone who shouldn't be voting, someone who is an illegal alien, someone who's a felon, someone who's out of state, someone who's dead, someone who doesn't even exist. That happens. I understand that the opposition, rather than try to achieve some form of consensus, wants to claim, for starters, that there is no voter fraud. In fact, Philadelphia Inquirer did a very good piece today, analysis in-person vote fraud near zero. As far as it goes, it's completely accurate, but sadly somewhat incomplete. Voter fraud takes place under several guidance. The law that is being currently debated in Pennsylvania also includes very important protections for absentee votes, increasing the safeguard and integrity of those. Now, what the Inquirer investigation found was that there are not very many prosecutions for people showing up at the polls and pretending they're someone else and voting. Yes, and the number of times people who shoplift are caught and convicted is also very small. It's the tip of an iceberg. You cannot judge the incidence of an event by how many prosecutions there are, for several reasons. Your former mayor in Philadelphia once told me, the criminal justice system here is highly selective in what it decides to pursue. I don't think that will be a surprise to you. But even the criminal justice system in Pennsylvania eventually finds there are problems. A former congressman from Pennsylvania a few years back was convicted of going into nursing homes and assisting Alzheimer's patients with their ballots. Now, if a former congressman will do that, Austin Murphy was his name, what in the world will people of less repute and less reputation to protect do? Al Schmidt, the election city commissioner, one of 3 in Philadelphia, has come out with a recent report. He goes into great detail. As a matter of fact, he surveyed 1% of the city's 1,687 precincts. Double voting, voter impersonation, non-citizens, 23 cases of people not eligible to vote but voted anyway. Even if we take the contention of those who say voter fraud is very rare, we have elections that are decided by this. 537 votes in Florida decided the entire presidential election of 2000. 312 votes decided the Minnesota Senate race of Al Franken and Norm Coleman in 2008. That election had enormous consequences. Al Franken, 312 votes, provided the 60th vote, once he was seated after 8 months of court cases, the 60th vote to break the filibuster against Obamacare. Obamacare would not exist in its current form without Al Franken's 60th vote. It would not have passed. And that 60th vote is frankly still under a cloud. We now know from the work of a group called Minnesota Majority that 1,100 felons, in addition to the other problems in that election, 1,100 felons voted illegally in Minnesota. They did not have their constitutional rights yet restored. Well, Minnesota Majority didn't do this work with any help from anyone. Prosecutors were completely uninterested. Prosecutors hate voter fraud cases. They hate them because they're extremely difficult to prove, extremely difficult and costly to pursue, and most prosecutors are political in some sense. If you go after Republican voter fraud, and by the way, there was a Republican machine in Philadelphia until the 1950s. They committed voter fraud with abandon. This is not a partisan issue. It was replaced by a Democratic machine that commits voter fraud with abandon. I guess turnabout is fair play. These felons voted illegally. The prosecutors didn't find them. The election officials didn't find them. They want to often bury their mistakes, so to speak. There's a citizens group that found them. Now, we checked out these 1,100. They're real. How do we know they're real? Well, in Minnesota, you can only convict someone if you're a felon voting illegally if you actually are stupid enough. Some criminals are dumb. That's how they get caught. If you're stupid enough to say, yes, I am a felon, yes, I knew I couldn't vote, and what's your business? What's your problem with that? All you have to do if you're a felon voting illegally in Minnesota is say, oh, I didn't know. You mean I didn't get my right to vote restored? Oh, that means you can't prove intent. That means you can't convict them. So you basically could only go after the people stupid enough to say, I did it, I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. We have now had 191 people convicted in Minnesota of voting illegally in that election as felons in that one race that was decided by 312 votes. 191. There are 66 more in the pipeline. There are dozens more being investigated. We may yet get to the point where there are more people convicted illegally of voting in that election than the margin of victory. Now, because it's a secret ballot, we have no way of knowing how those felons voted. But there are many academic studies, and there are many places where people register by party. And there's also, Fox News went and interviewed 10 of these people randomly, and the answer that 9 out of 10 gave was the same, and his name was Franken. Look, I'm not trying to make any larger point except the majority of those 1,100 people probably voted for a certain candidate. And the race was decided by 312 votes. Now, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals has addressed this issue of why you can't seem to find a lot of voter impersonation in person. This is the Federal Appeals Court that upheld the voter ID law in Indiana. And what they said is, this is in response to claims by the ACLU at the time that there have been no investigations or prosecutions of in-person voter fraud in Indiana. As the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ruled, without requiring a photo ID, there is little, if any, chance of ever preventing this type of voter fraud. The absence of prosecutions is explained by the endemic under-enforcement of voter fraud cases and the extreme difficulty of apprehending a voter impersonator. In other words, if someone is dead, and by the way, the Pew Center on the States, a distinctly nonpartisan group, says there are 1.8 million dead people registered to vote in this country. If you go in and register, I'm sorry, if you go in and vote in the name of a dead person, they're not likely to complain. This is why I'm opposed to representation without respiration. They're not likely to complain. If you go in and vote in the name of a dead person, how would you ever get caught? How would anyone ever know unless you decided to confess to someone other than your priest? No one would know. I am telling you, unless you're really stupid or guilt-stricken, this is the perfect crime. I'm not saying it's rampant, but it is more than zero. And what we are asking is, this is a country where you cannot function in mainstream society without an ID. Think about all the things you can't do. You can't cash a check. You can't apply for welfare. You can't travel. You can't buy, someone here reminded me, many prescription drugs. You can't even buy Sudafed without an ID. You can't check into a hotel. You can't buy an Amtrak ticket in many cases. You can't enter the federal court building here and exercise your rights of petition and grievance without showing a photo ID. So, I don't think there are that many people without photo ID. In fact, the study by the American Center's Study for the Advancement of Elections found that the number of people in those 3 states that they surveyed that didn't have a photo ID was 0.5%. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't such people. Here's my proposal. Let's go out and get them a free ID. Yes. Now, the other side is spending, by my best estimate, in the last couple of years, they have probably spent the equivalent of $10 to $12 million on lawyers' fees, litigation costs, and public relations efforts to fight these voter ID laws. If they had spent a portion of that to get people free IDs, we might have solved this problem, and there'd be no debate. They won't do that. Their other argument is, well, okay, there's no impersonation fraud, but there is absentee ballot fraud. You should focus on that. Well, this bill does focus on absentee ballot fraud in addition to the voter ID, and they oppose the absentee ballot fraud measures as well. You can't win with these people. Look, Andrew Young, former mayor of Atlanta, Jimmy Carter's UN ambassador, former confidant and aide de camp to Martin Luther King. I interviewed him. He said, I don't understand what the problem here is. We are doing people a favor if we get them an ID. You can't function in life without one. And he applauded Georgia, which sent mobile vans around to get people a free ID. South Carolina said, we not only will get you a free ID, if you need a ride to the DMV to get your ID, we'll provide it. In the first year of the program, 23 people availed themselves of this offer. This is a myth. It is a myth that the Brennan Center puts out. By the way, to cite a so-called think tank in New York, which is a party to litigation in all these cases, the Brennan Center is a litigant. I don't think you need to look at their surveys with complete objectivity. I mean, I know how their survey was conducted. They called a bunch of people in a random telephone poll, and they said, do you immediately have at hand, can you immediately obtain the required photo documentation that would be necessary for you to vote? And this poll claimed that 10% of the population didn't have a photo ID, and 25% of African Americans did. Is there a single person in this room? Is there a single person in this room who believes the patronizing, dehumanizing claim that 1 out of 4 African Americans in this country don't have an ID? Of course not. They're valued members of our society. They work. They participate fully. And if there are any that don't, let's get them one. But that's not what this is about. This is about something else. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I'll tell you this much. There may be some people who oppose these laws who know a lot more about what goes on behind the curtain than I do, or what other people here in this room do. And maybe they're not interested in letting us see what's behind the curtain. or in preventing what's happening behind the curtain. Philadelphia was this was 15 years ago, was one of my first initiations. Sorry, it's almost 20 years ago now. The Stinson State Senate race in Philadelphia. A federal judge had to throw out the election because of massive voter fraud. By the way, that one election decided control of the Pennsylvania State Senate. I know that Stephanie Singer has cast doubt on Al Schmidt's report on election fraud, but last year she said election fraud was a real problem in Philadelphia. Apparently this year she doesn't. All right, people can change their mind. Look, I want to have a compromise here. I want to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Eric Holder isn't interested in compromise. He's not interested in reality. Look, 2 weeks ago, Eric Holder went to the NAACP convention to denounce voter ID laws as the return of Jim Crow poll tax. Well, in order to get into cover that speech, you had to show a photo ID. Eric Holder actually said the other day, someone said, well, Mr. Holder, you have to show a photo ID to enter the Justice Department. He said, no, you don't. No, you don't. And the reporter was just gobsmacked. He said, but yes, you do. No, anybody can come in and have a conversation with me. They don't have to show anything. I mean, just make stuff up. Now, the man is shameless to this extent. In May, a 22-year-old bearded kid with earrings showed up at his polling place in Washington, D.C. Eric Holder has been in the same polling place for 32 years. You'd think they know him. And this 22-year-old kid with beard and the earrings shows up and says, do you have an Eric Holder at such and such Brentwood Terrace? Yes, here's your ballot. Sign here. Now, notice the kid didn't say, I am Eric Holder, I want to vote. That would have been wrong. He didn't take the ballot and vote. That would have also been wrong. But he demonstrated how entirely easy it is to do this. I can assure you this 22-year-old kid with beard and earrings does not resemble Eric Holder. Seriously, he just doesn't. So, let's get serious about this. The Pennsylvania law, these are facts. Pennsylvania law says as follows. You need a photo ID, or you need, there's several other versions of identification that you need. Okay, you should show them. If you don't have them at the polling place, by the way, you can always vote absentee as well. No ID is required to vote absentee. If you show up at the polling place and you don't have the requisite ID, you can vote. You vote a provisional ballot. It's set aside. Within 6 days, you have to contact the authorities by either in person, email, or fax, and you provide the requisite identification. You can send a Xerox of something, whatever. Okay, if you don't have any of those, and the claim is, well, you know, to get a free ID, some people might have to go get a copy of their birth certificate that costs $15 or whatever. If you don't have the requisite documentation to get your free state ID, you claim indigency. You sign an affidavit at that point saying, I am who I say I am, and your vote is counted. There is nothing in this law that could conceivably prevent anyone from voting, even if they didn't have an ID. That's the law. I've read it. I've run it by several lawyers. This opposition is just bizarro world. There must be some other motivation here. Maybe it's the fact that Philadelphia has more registered voters than it has adults over the age of 18 according to the census. We call this a clue that mischief may be afoot. And as I said, this is nonpartisan. There are Republicans who commit voter fraud, but since the Republican machine collapsed in Philadelphia in the 1950s, the fraud has moved from one party to another. You know, you follow you say you follow the money, I follow the votes. That's what the reality of here is. This shouldn't be a partisan issue because it's in all of our interest to have clean and fair elections. Let me tell you, I remember Florida 2000. It was ugly. We had a president take office and 40% of the people didn't think he was legitimately elected. That hurt this country. Conceivably could have hurt our response if 9/11 had gone a different way, or there'd been more attacks after 9/11, or a different response. We don't want another Florida. But this year, the chances of another Florida are greater than ever. Whether it's through bureaucratic bungling or fraud, you could have contested elections not in one state, Florida, but in 4, 5, or 6 states if it's close enough. This would not be good for the country. We do not want decisions supposedly needed to be made by voters thrown into the hands of lawyers and judges. It's not how the system is supposed to work. I want to avoid a Florida. We can do this. First of all, by pointing out all of the weaknesses in the system, and that's what Al Schmidt's report does in part. A lot of this is incompetence. You know, the laws are such that sometimes you can't tell where the incompetence ends and the fraud begins. Sometimes the incompetence just makes the fraud easier. If it's incompetence, we need to talk about it and make sure the election officials commit less of it before the election. If it's fraud, just talking about fraud, letting people know there's someone watching, just like shoplifting. You know, the way that stores cut down on shoplifting is very simple. They don't often spend an enormous amount on security. What they do is they put up signs that say, shoplifters will be prosecuted. They put up cameras. Do you think people are watching those cameras 24 hours a day? Of course not. Most of the time they're not watching them, but they're there. And they cut down on errant shoplifting, people who will do it if they think there's no risk. Well, if there's absolutely no penalty for voter fraud, there are very few prosecutions, no one is looking, no one is asking for ID, you're going to get more voter fraud. These are just sensible steps. We ask for ID and everything else. Now, always the last refuge of a scoundrel is no longer patriotism, it's now yelling racism in a crowded local theater. Well, I'm here to tell you, I've been called a racist so often now, I literally have become inured to it. I mean, it's sort of like the old days when people would call everyone a communist, and it meant nothing after a while. Look, there is racism in this country, and if there is any racist behavior, it needs to be rooted out and dealt with. But yelling racism about everything is ridiculous. Voter ID laws are supported by 80% of Americans. Every demographic group supports these. African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, liberals, Democrats. Every demographic group supports voter ID laws. In fact, support for voter ID laws is so high, a leading pollster told me, this poll's higher than motherhood or apple pie because some people are estranged from their mother and some people are allergic to or don't like apple pie. So I guess all of these minorities who support voter ID laws are victims of false consciousness. They don't understand how racist and discriminatory this is. Rhode Island, Democratic legislature, 5-to-1 Democratic legislature, passed a voter ID law. Its sponsor was Harold Metz, the only African-American senator in the body, a Democrat. He said, fraud is rife in Providence, Rhode Island. My constituents had it up to here. They finally said, we want you to do something about it, and I did it. The National Party tried to stop me. I went ahead. I passed the bill through the Senate. I took it to the State House. The State House is run by Gideon Fox, the first African-American speaker of that body. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the voter ID law. It was signed into law by the independent governor, Lincoln Chafee, who I can assure you, if you talk to any conservative Republicans, will tell you is no conservative Republican. In the majority of Democrats in the Kansas legislature voted for this. It is not partisan everywhere. Artur Davis, the former Democratic congressman from Alabama, the man who seconded Barack Obama's nomination to the presidency at the Denver Convention, came out last year and said, I can no longer claim voter ID laws are discriminatory. The real discrimination takes place in my district in southern Alabama, where political machines perpetuate their existence, continue to offer horrible public schools, horrible roads, horrible services, and they stay empowered by stealing elections. The real voter suppression, he says, in this country is political machines suppressing the rights of minority voters to overturn political machines that offer them bad government. That is the real voter suppression. So I don't think we need to take this kind of attack anymore. The people who are most victimized by voter fraud in this country are reform-minded residents of inner cities, whether it's Detroit or St. Louis or Philadelphia, who are constantly given bad government, and every time they rise up and try to change things, political machines steal the election from them. It's happened in Detroit. It's happened in various other places. Maybe it's happened here at some point. So I've had enough of it. I think this law is not a perfect law. I would have written it a little differently. But the attacks on it are preposterous and absurd on their face. And I think ultimately, this is all a delaying tactic to make sure it isn't implemented before November 6th, which coincidentally happens to be the date of the next election. How convenient. With that, I'll take your question, a couple questions, and then we'll go to the panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a couple of questions, time for a couple of questions, and we're going to move on to panel discussion. So, who would, any? Okay, Robert?
Thanks, Don. You know, back in 1991, I was homeless in this city for about 4 years. I had only 2 pieces of ID, a driver's license and my welfare ID card. And if I can do it going from park bench to shelter, to park bench to shelter, there's no excuse for anyone else. None.
Well, if you had welfare, you had to show ID to get welfare,
That's
right?
correct.
Well, I mean, what can you do in this life without an ID? I mean, do these people live in caves? By the way, there are provisions in the law. If you're bedridden in a nursing home or something like that, the local nursing home administrators can fill out an identification for you that serves as the proper ID. And by the way, you can always vote absentee. And most people in nursing homes do. Yes?
Hi. That's her. Nursing homes and assisted living and all. Have you found voter fraud or people not ethically, people filling out other people's absentee ballot or applying for absentee ballots for people that are in nursing homes?
I am shocked that you would think that would happen. No! There'd be no temptation for anyone to do something like that. I quote in my book, by the way, there's a Democratic commissioner in Washington, I think it's Fayette County here in Pittsburgh, who basically went after the nursing home voter fraud and was basically read out of his political party for raising inconvenient issues. After Congressman Murphy was convicted of nursing home voter fraud, Pennsylvania did change its law. I believe that you can only do voting in the nursing home if you have people from both major political parties show up on a designated day and they observe each other as they go from bed to bed. So I believe there is less of that kind of fraud. And by the way, I hate to say this, but the same people who opposed the voter ID law opposed changing the nursing home law those years ago. Do you detect a pattern here?
Okay, we have 2 more questions, and then we're going to turn to the discussion.
Yeah. Has the ACLU made some sort of civil liberty argument on this at all?
Yes, they say voting is a fundamental constitutional right. It is not like travel. It is not like all of these other things. Well, you know, if you get a marriage license in Pennsylvania, you know what you have to do to get a marriage license? You have to show ID. Is marriage a fundamental right? I think it is. If you want to enter a federal building, you have to show an ID. Is that a fundamental right? If you want to go and visit your governmental officials and petition for grievances? I think that's a fundamental right, but we make you show ID. So I think they're being highly selected in their civil liberties argument. Look, I used to be a member of the ACLU many years ago, until they were taken over by the forces of darkness and just became thoroughly politicized. But they had a fine, honorable tradition, and I support some of the things they do. And the ACLU constantly reminds me each chapter is different. The one here is not serving their membership well. Last one.
As Roger just pointed out, you need ID to get voter registration, so that kind of...
No, actually quite not, you don't.
Yeah.
If you fill out the postcard and drop it in the mail, you don't have to show ID. Maybe if you go to the office, you have to show ID.
Right. Not from
Or maybe, I don't know. I freely admit I'm not an expert on all Pennsylvania state voting laws.
My question is, because I'm not familiar with the absentee ballot, can you just quickly tell us what the requirements are for absentee ballot?
I do not know if you have no excuse absentee voting in Pennsylvania. I don't think.
You don't have no excuse.
Your Social
Yeah.
Security, the last 4 digits of your Social Security number or your
Driver's license.
Right, but I don't think you have to, I think that even if you have, if you have an excuse required to get an absentee ballot, obviously it's never enforced. No one is ever prosecuted if you tell a fib and say you need an absentee ballot. What the law says, the new law says, is that you're going to have to provide proof of identification and provide information in the application which can lead you to trace the absentee ballot. This is standard. It's not, I think, particularly searching in its invasion of privacy. You know, driver's license, social security, last few digits. Okay, let's one more and that's it. Yes.
Yeah, mine is not really a question.
Oh, well, in that case, we got a problem.
Okay.
We got a problem if it's not a question. But you can task me afterwards.
Okay. All right.
Thank you so much. And I'll be happy, I'll be signing up there. I'm happy to chat with you. And if you want to chat, we'll have 5 minutes.